That what over the 50-year history has been the most accurate presidential election night coverage, and that's on CBS.
Waiting in line if you cast your ballot after 5. The Secretary of State is predicting that
what over the 50-year history has been the most accurate presidential election night coverage, and that's on CBS. Now, good evening. In this country, in any presidential election year, deciding a president of the United States, and tonight also deciding who's going to control the House and the Senate. We've said it could be a very long night, but frankly, we don't know that it's going to be that. We may have a decision early in the evening. We think it may be the closest election in 40 years, but nobody can say that for certain at this juncture. So settle in and welcome to our continuous CBS News election night coverage. We're here now for as long as it takes to bring you the clearest, fastest, and most accurate picture of tonight's results. Let's get one thing straight right from the get-go. We would rather be last in reporting a return than to be wrong. And again, our record demonstrates that true. If you hear someplace else that somebody's carried a state and you're off, as you shouldn't be, watching them, then come back here, because if we say somebody has carried a state, you can pretty much take it to the bank, book it, that that's true. We'll also be telling you not just who wins, but why. The polls are still open in many places as America chooses the next president. There's much at stake: bread and butter issues, Social Security, taxes, schools, health care, and more. And a handful of seats in the House and Senate could tip the balance in the battle for control of Congress. What happens tonight will set the nation's next agenda for the 21st century. There are many who believe that this election is not just about the next 4 years, but it may well decide the direction of our country for the next generation. Our agenda is to tell you the latest and give you the context. Now, Ed Bradley, Bush is obviously off to a good start. What have you noticed of special interest so far?
Well, I think that if you take a look at what's happening in Florida, it's really amazing at this point, because it still is so much in play. And if you take a look at the gender gap in Florida, for one thing, it seems to be working for Al Gore, that more women voted in that state, and he got a much bigger percentage of that vote. Also, black turnout is higher in Florida, and Gore did better among Hispanics than Bill Clinton did 4 years ago. But the interesting thing about Florida, Dan, is that both candidates aimed their message at seniors, because they make up almost a third of the electorate in Florida. And if you look at the issues that are important to voters in Florida, you think they would be those issues, but that's not the case. Medicare and health care, prescription drugs are down at the bottom at 8% rather. The two most important issues, economy and jobs and education. How did the two candidates do among seniors? They basically split the vote, but Al Gore is doing much better among those voters who are 18 to 29, and for me, that's a big surprise in Florida.
Well, while we wait for the returns to come in, Ed, and around the table from Florida, let's show you what the electoral vote stands at this hour. We're going to be showing this to you throughout tonight because it's the simplest way to understand where things are. 270 electoral votes needed to win. Bush starts off with 28. He was expected to get a jump start, and he has, mostly because many of the polls that close early are in areas that were generally believed going for Bush. Gore has 3. Vermont's the only state he's carried thus far. Now, the election, in many ways, boiled down to 14 so-called battleground states. These are states where it's too close to call and where the election is likely to be decided. They begin with Florida, then move up to Pennsylvania, 23 electoral votes there. Pennsylvania, the polls have not yet closed there. Michigan with 18. If you want 3 to watch, those are the 3: Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Now, the so-called battleground states also include other states where the polls are still open. That would be Maine with 4 electoral votes, said to be sort of hanging in the balance, although a lot of people think Bush will carry it because the Bush family has a home there. In New Hampshire, the polls have closed, don't yet know how that one's going to go. West Virginia with 5 electoral votes is one of the battleground states. Tennessee with 11 is another. Arkansas with 6. Iowa with 5. Wisconsin, New Mexico, Oregon, and Washington, all considered to be battleground states. Bob Schieffer is covering the battle for control of the Senate. Bob, the polls have closed in Virginia. A Senate race there, ugly enough, nasty enough to gag a buzzer. Do we have the returns on it yet?
No, they have not called the race yet. Chuck Robb was hoping for a huge turnout of black voters. He said 20% of the electorate would have to be black voters for him to win. It does not appear that many blacks turned out. It may be around 15% of the electorate. Can I go back to Florida, though, Dan?
Absolutely.
You know, we've had the call there in the Senate race. Bill Nelson, the Democrat, has won. And I think this may tell us something about what may happen in the presidential race, because one of the things we asked voters down there what was important to them, as you know, Social Security, we've been talking about it. Well, look at this. About a third of the voters down there said using the surplus to take care and keep Social Security solvent was an important thing to them, and 60% of those people voted for the Democrat Nelson. So that may tell you that Al Gore may have a bit of an edge in Florida. We'll have to wait and see what happens.
We'll have to wait and see. I want to pick up on that. Given that information, where Social Security seemed to cut so heavily in favor of the Democrats in picking up this Senate seat in Florida, with the polls closed, we're now waiting for the returns to come in and make a decision, be able to announce, well, okay, somebody has carried Florida. In the past, does this carry over from Senate race to the presidential race in a state like Florida, Bob?
Well, sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But when you're talking about one issue like Social Security, we know that Al Gore hammered away at Social Security. Joe Lieberman, as Governor Jeb Bush said, parked his trailer down there and may have to pay income tax. Of course, they don't have one in Florida. He was in Florida so much, but he was hammering away at Social Security. So I would say the fact that the Democrat has won in the Senate seat in Florida is good news for Al Gore at the very least.
Well, the fact that Joe Lieberman, the senator from Connecticut, is on the ticket has not hurt Gore's chances in Florida. I want to emphasize to you now that the polls are closed in Florida, but it may or may not be a long while before we know how that state's going to go in the presidential race. Now, Leslie Stahl is covering the fight for control of the House of Representatives. The Democrats, Leslie, need a net pickup of 7.
7. And it wasn't a week ago that the Democrats weren't telling us that they were sure they were going to be able to get those 7 votes. But in the last week, most of the states that they were counting on, the seats they were counting on, the races, have tightened up and some moved the other way. So it's unsure as we start the night. But let's take a look at what the current House looks like. At the moment, the House of Representatives is divided almost equally down the middle. The Democrats have 210 seats. The Republicans have 223. There are 2 independents. 1 votes with the Democrats, 1 votes with the Republicans. As Dan said, the Democrats to take over control need a net gain of 7. Now, one of the first states that we've been looking at for an early sign of how things will go tonight is Kentucky, where there are 3 Republican incumbents the Democrats were eyeing as kind of juicy targets. Well, so far, the Democrats have lost one of those seats, and they're trailing in the other. This is not a good sign for the Democrats so far, Dan.
Not a good sign for the Democrats in the early going in their ability to take over the House of Representatives, but a reasonable sign in they pick up 1 Senate seat in Florida. We'll see how that goes along. Joining us tonight from Nashville, Tennessee, is Bill Dayton.
More than George Bush then having to run all of the smaller states.
We see Mrs. Gore there with the Vice President voting today. Is she as fresh most of the time as he is?
She really is, Peter. She is, as many people know, one of his best assets on the campaign trail. She lightens him up. In fact, as he got on the plane to come home now in the early morning hours, 7, 8 a.m. This morning to come home to Tennessee, she kind of pushed him off on the stairway just so she could take a picture of him. She's a real amateur photographer.
Thousands and thousands and thousands of rolls and films from the campaign. Thanks, Terry. We'll be back to you before long. Want to check in very briefly now with ABC's Dean Reynolds, who's been the last 18 months with Governor Bush. I suspect also a little ragged around the edges at this point. But I saw the governor, Dean, on television a little while ago looking very calm, very cool, and that was the public message, was it not?
That's right, Peter. He had about 5 solid hours of sleep, he said, overnight. Not for him, the campaigning until dawn. Their feeling here is rather upbeat and anticipatory. One of them said they're waiting for that exclamation point to affirm what they all believe will happen tonight.
Now, you're outside the State House. It's fairly early in the evening there in Austin. Tell us what's going on behind you.
Well, it's freezing. We're all freezing here. It's uncommonly cold for this time of year in Austin. There's a great big screen behind me, and they're playing the biography of the governor, and a small crowd is gathering, but I think the wiser people are probably staying home.
Okay, Dean, thank you very much. Dean Reynolds, who's with Governor Bush's campaign in Austin, Texas, which has turned out to be one of the most popular states in the South, one of the most popular states in Texas, university town among other, great restaurant town, great music town. So the press corps that's had to get back there occasionally with Mr. Bush hasn't suffered altogether. George Stephanopoulos, question for you about the weather. I think you said to me at one point early in the campaign, it basically cancels out. There's been some rain somewhere, there's been some snow.
I think it should, although I have to say the Gore campaign seemed much more worried about the weather in the Midwest than the Bush campaign did. Donna Brazil, the campaign manager of the Gore campaign, was obsessively checking the weather reports over the last few days because she was concerned that if there was a lot of rain, a lot of sleet, they wouldn't get the full African-American vote in a lot of the big cities. Now, we've had some early indications, not from the Midwest, but from Florida, where I think the weather was fine, that the African-American vote was 5 points higher than it was in 1996, and that is a good sign for Democrats.
Absolutely crucial to him in half a dozen places.
No question. It's crucial in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and it was probably a big help, or it could be a big help to Mrs. Clinton here in New York.
And you, I know, got out with both campaigns this year. They differed in many respects, as Dean Reynolds alludes. Governor Bush was much more laid back in terms of his campaigning than Mr. Gore.
Oh, there's no question about it. And he had a really good relationship, I think, from what I could tell, with all the members of the press on his plane. I only went out with him for one weekend, but he was very laid back, very easygoing, and built up a strong relationship. He also, and I think the Bush campaign has done a terrific job all year of giving off a sense of confidence that they really know what they're doing, even at times when it didn't look like so sure.
Let's ask our director, Roger Goodman. Is Dean Reynolds still there in Austin at the moment?
I'm here.
He isn't there. I was going to ask him about what the governor did when he got up this morning. One of the first things he did was call his mother and father.
And they've been active in this campaign as well.
Yeah, he is there. Dean, are you there?
Yes, Peter.
The governor made a lot of calls today. Who did he call?
Well, he called a voter in Florida, Orlando, Florida, then he called another in Detroit, Michigan, and he called his parents to assure them that he felt fine and that they shouldn't be nervous.
And who's there with him in terms of family today?
They'll all be there this evening. The governor's having dinner with his father right now, and then later on the whole Bush clan will be at the hotel here in Austin to watch the returns.
And Terry Moran, one of the sad things, of course, for the vice president is that his father died not too very long ago, but his mother is with him, right?
His mother is with him. He lunched with her today after that marathon, and she's here with him in Nashville tonight. And 30 years ago, Peter, on election night 30 years ago, the Gore family suffered a terrible defeat, electoral defeat, when his father went down to defeat for re-election in the United States Senate. That's a bad memory, one that they're hoping they can overcome tonight.
Okay, thanks very much, Chairman. Now, we've just had an interesting alert from the Associated Press, which will give you some real sense now of how heavy the vote is in some places. The AP reports from St. Louis that a circuit judge in St. Louis has ordered the polls there to remain open until 10 p.m. And Broward County in southern Florida, which has been touch and go all through the campaign, is going to have extended hours as well. But if you're just joining us at the moment, just take a quick look at what we are looking at the moment. There's the map of the country, 270 electoral votes needed to win. I'm going to say it time again. We project already that Governor Bush has won in Indiana, Kentucky, and South Carolina, that New Hampshire is too close to call, but up there in the Northeast, the real bastion of Mr. Gore's support is the Northeast here, at least on this coast, and we project he has won in Vermont, Virginia, Georgia, Florida, all too close to call. Now, national election in three ways: presidential, House, and the Senate, of course, and a state and local election in many, many ways, with some of those state and local elections having very high profile for the rest of the country, but vital to everybody who lives in whatever respective community you live in. So we're going to break for a few minutes now to let ABC news stations across the country bring you up to date with the local races in your area. I hope you'll stay with us. I'm Peter Jennings for ABC 2000.
Around the world, mothers want to protect and nurture.
Is using to describe its own mood, upbeat, serene, cautiously optimistic. The early returns and word they're hearing from their folks in the field is adding to that upbeat mood. Now, the one